Discoveries, Essential Truths for Relationships. Chapter 8, Understanding Your Spouse's World. Showing understanding in marriage. Imagine that my wife Nancy is in her 40th week of pregnancy and has been in hard labor all night and most of the next day. I am by her side trying to comfort her. She is exhausted from relentless and inexpressible pain. Imagine that she groans, "I just don't know if I can keep going." Let's imagine that I say, "I don't know how you I know just how you feel." Nancy would have every right to rise out of bed and smite me. I don't know how she feels. My body has never experienced 14 hours of labor, and even if it had, it would still diminish her current painful experience if I redirected attention from her agony to myself. There is hardly a poorer way to show understanding or compassion than to say to someone in pain, "I know just how you feel." This is equally true whether the pain is physical or emotional. By the way, I did not say that to my wife. When our firstborn was placed in my arms, I said, "Amazing. We need to have more children." Unfortunately, those were not the words Nancy was ready to hear immediately after going through labor and childbirth. It was difficult for us to think outside our own experience and fully enter someone else's. There are times when a dear one is suffering and we want to offer words of comfort and compassion. What are the best ways of doing that? Let's start with ineffective ways to show understanding. Many of our efforts to show compassion have had an opposite effect from the one we intended. They make a person feel mad or misunderstood. Following are some examples of things we should not do. Don't jump in and immediately give advice. Here are my thoughts on that. What you need to do is, when something like this happens to me, here is what I do. Don't talk about your feelings and experiences instead of theirs. I know just how you feel. Same thing happened to me. That's nothing. You should hear what happened to me. That just makes me so angry because don't make your spouse's pain seem unimportant. I think you're overreacting. Everything will seem better tomorrow. That's too bad. Now I have something else we need to discuss. When people are in emotional pain, the first gift you can give them is the willingness to listen. Provide them a safe harbor in which they can express whatever they want to share. Don't interrupt with questions or opinions. Don't immediately begin offering counsel. Avoid becoming distracted by planning on what you are going to say when it is your turn to talk. Don't become impatient and signal they are taking too long to share their experience. Struggling with emotional pain is an experience that is very personal and very significant to the person experiencing it in that moment. He or she doesn't feel anyone really understands. And the person is right. Even if you have listened carefully or have been in similar circumstances, you can't fully understand how he or she is feeling. That's why a person who is hurting would probably rather have you say, "I'm so sorry this is happening to you. I wish I could understand how sad, hurt, or lonely you feel." Sometimes the best way to show understanding is to admit that you can't understand exactly how the person feels. The key to showing understanding is identifying the other person's emotion. After we have listened and watched carefully to learn how a person is feeling, we might do and say one of the following effective things. Acknowledge or identify the person's feeling. You feel strongly about this. You seem to feel very concerned, upset, hurt, confused, frustrated, lonely, sad. I can see why you feel that way. Invite more discussion. I would like to understand how you are feeling. Will you tell me more? What did that feel like? I bet that was hard for you. Listen with the intent to understand. Let me see if I understand. You feel like blank. It sounds like you feel lonely, confused, sad. So when you say blank, do you mean blank? These examples of poor and good ways to show understanding are adapted from the publication Being Understanding, which I wrote for the Alabama Cooperative Extension System. Effective compassion keeps the focus on the person in pain. It sets aside my own discomforts so I can minister to the one who is suffering. When the Good Samaritan was ministering to the wounded and half dead man, He did not say, I know you're in bad shape, but my bunions are killing me. No, he set about doing all he could for this injured and suffering stranger. We too must set aside our discomforts to minister to those who are suffering. All this gets more complicated when both partners in a marriage feel hurt and distressed. When one person can set aside his or her pain to offer comfort, healing is advanced. But that is rare. When we feel attacked by another person, we tend to counterattack. When a wife enumerates a husband's fault, he is likely to respond in kind. Sometimes the best thing we can do when both parties are in distress is to take a time out. During the timeout, we are wise not to rehearse our own complaints, but to try to understand our partner's pain. Our spouse may express pain, dismay, or discouragement several times a day. Though it may be difficult, when we regularly offer genuine compassion, a bond of trust and love is built that will make the relationship stronger and more heavenly. Making mountains out of molehills. Several years ago, Nancy and I attended a community lecture with another couple. After the lecture, I asked them how they liked the program. The husband stated rather deliberately, "It was good," pause, but the speaker talked way too fast. Instantly, the wife responded, "Oh no, how can you say that? It was just right." There's human nature again. We all have our reasons for seeing things the way we do, and we tend to be critical of those who see it differently. The husband mentioned above likes things slow and deliberate. The wife is impressed by knowledge. In addition, a fast delivery makes her think the speaker is very intelligent. And there are other differences. He is guileless, so he expresses concerns simply and directly. She likes being positive, so she was embarrassed by his criticism of the prominent speaker. Ironically, we humans are quite willing to criticize the people who irritate us when they criticize the people who irritate them. We humans are so immersed in our own perspectives that we bump against others, especially the people we see daily. The Lord declared that among the early saints of Missouri, there were jarrings and contentions and envyings and strifes. We quite naturally turn differences in our preferences into disagreements that damage our relationship. We turn molehills into mountains. This will not lead us to Zion. Imagine that the wife was willing to lead with compassion rather than criticism. Imagine that she stepped out of her perspective for a time and joined her husband in this. She might have said, "That makes sense. You like time to think about things. I can see that you would have enjoyed the program more if the man had spoken so fast." Notice that the wife didn't necessarily agree with her husband, but she might still feel the lecture was just right for her. And she might still feel the lecture was right for her. But she can understand and appreciate her husband's perspective. We don't have to club each other with our differences. We can appreciate our spouse's perspectives and celebrate the lessons we learn from him or her. As G.K. Chesterton wrote, "How much larger your life would be if you could become smaller in it. You would begin to be interested in others. You would break out of this tiny theater in which your own little plot is always being played, and you would find yourself under a freer sky in a street full of splendid strangers." Indeed, our spouses and family members can cease being our enemies and can become those splendid strangers with whom we make our life journeys, even our eternal journeys. When the Lord instructed us to agree with thine adversary quickly, whilst thou art in the way with them, he may have been inviting us to be less prickly and more willing to appreciate the other people's points of view. This willingness will certainly bring us a step closer to Zion. We can show compassion rather than impatience when we see things differently. And in showing compassion, our hearts will be softened and filled with understanding for our spouses. Aligning our vision in marriage. Years ago, I asked my wife Nancy a question. She gave an answer that seemed quite unrelated to my question. Baffled and annoyed, I blinked a few times to clear my mind. Had she heard and understood my question? Then I realized for the first time that she and I experienced entirely different things in our conversation. I grew up with a philosophical, articulate, and precise father. He loved to reason with his wife and children. We often sat around the table exploring various subjects, mostly the gospel. He was careful about logic and grammar. I tried to learn from him. Nancy grew up quite differently. Her dad was a gentleman of few words and loved finding uses for cast-off stuff. He gathered this and that from the dump and made a shed or a statue. His creations were practical and imaginative. A person needed to watch him carefully to figure out what he had on his mind. Nancy was good at understanding her father. She learned a lot from him. After almost 50 years of marriage, I made a fresh discovery about my beloved Nancy. In any conversation, she notices what people are doing and feeling. She hears the context of people's lives and emotions more than she hears words. Those factors influence her understanding of my messages, no matter what I say. In contrast, regardless of what is happening around me, I focus on the words and the logic. I love clarity and precision. I want Nancy to listen to my words and offer precise answers. While this tendency of Nancy's can sometimes create communication difficulties between us, I also view it as one of her great gifts. It makes her aware of people in gatherings who need a friend or a word of encouragement. She seems to have a sixth sense about the needs of others. I love that about her. There are other ways my wife and I think differently. She is more likely to see danger, and I am more likely to see adventure. She is quiet and reflective. I'm enthusiastic and passionate. She values healthy food, and I relish less healthy but more exciting options. She is task-oriented, and I am fun-loving. It is surprising how differently two people can see our shared world. Maybe we could compare our different perceptions of the world to binocular vision. Humans have two eyes, not only to provide a wider range of vision, but also to see that we can perceive depth. For this to work, the two eyes must be carefully coordinated. They must align and focus together. Babies learn to coordinate the views coming from both their eyes within a few months of life. Learning to coordinate our different views in the world and marriage can take decades. We come from families that are vastly different, not only in the way they communicate, but in the way they define closeness, express emotions, and solve problems. Typically, our spouses are more different from us than we realize. We all have our own specific ways of reacting to the world around us. Yet our personal way may seem so natural, so right and sensible. We expect our spouse to be like us. When that is not the case, we judge them or him or her to be defective. So how do we learn to coordinate our vision with our spouse? How do we learn to make productive use of our different ways of seeing the world? Here are a few ideas. Humility is the recognition that we don't see everything. In fact, we entirely miss some of the most important things, and often we are unaware of it. When we set aside our dogmatism and take a genuine interest in our spouse's view, we are likely to discover a lot. Explore your spouse's point of view. Ask questions, especially when something isn't making sense to you. Your spouse has coherent vision that you can only appreciate if you are attentive and inquisitive. Work to harmonize your two views. We are all tempted to dismiss other ways of seeing the world. When we are willing to understand and incorporate others' views into our own, we will see more and understand better. When we add our spouse's perspective to our own, we see far more. Instead of judging your wife or husband, we are able to appreciate what he or she values, and we are more likely to enjoy each other. Would you rather be right or be good? The default setting for human minds is evaluation. We are constantly evaluating what people say and do. A family member exclaims, "It's a beautiful day," and we immediately check the evidence to see if the pronouncement is fully justified. A spouse observes that the broccoli is overcooked, and we shake our heads internally thinking, "You always like your vegetables raw." Sometimes we are wise enough to keep our critical thoughts to ourselves. Even so, There is a price to be paid for having a contrary mindset. Imagine that instead of keeping a prosecuting attorney and our mental staff, we hired a peacemaker. A person cheerfully looked for areas of agreement. Would that change our internal dialogue and our relationship? In a word, yes. A family member exclaims, "It's a beautiful day," and we immediately do two things. First, we look for evidence in support of that exclamation. And second, we enter into the family member's spirit of rejoicing. It is glorious and beautiful. For good measure, we might add, "I'm glad I get to share it with you." My spouse observes that the broccoli is overcooked, and I do two things. First, my mental staff records that my spouse prefers broccoli less cooked. And second, I acknowledge her preference. Yes, you like the healthy choice. It's funny because I like my broccoli soft. Maybe I add a relationship message. I bet we can find a way to live together lovingly in spite of our different broccoli preferences. The scriptures are packed with Jesus Christ doing just those things. When the adulterous woman was dragged to Jesus by the scribes and Pharisees, they correctly observed that the law required that she be put to death. They were right that death by stoning could be the punishment for breaking any of the Ten Commandments, though it was rarely carried out. But the true motive of these Pharisees and scribes was to trap Jesus. If he prescribed stoning, they would say he was taking the law into his own hands. If he said the woman should be forgiven, he would be accused of blasphemy, itself a capital offense. We don't know if these scribes and Pharisees planned to carry out a stoning that day, but they certainly weren't thinking redemptively, lovingly, or charitably. Jesus' response was the perfect contrast to the attitude of the woman's accusers. He did not dishonor the law, but he said, "He that is without sin among you, let him first cast a stone at her." The wonderful irony is that Jesus was the only perfect person in that crowd, or any crowd, and he had no interest in stoning the woman. He wanted to save her. The scribes and Pharisees seemingly wanted to use the law to destroy her. Jesus wanted to use love, compassion, and his own sacrifice to save her. His own sacrifice. Jesus does not wish us well in our foolhardy journeys. Jesus does not just wish us well in our foolhardy journeys. He is willing to go to the garden and to the cross to rescue us, to cover our sins and win our hearts. What are we willing to do for the people around us? Are we willing to adapt ourselves, surrender a few preferences, and not demand that others agree with all our perspectives? Will we surrender our need to be right in order to bless others? In strong relationships, the Christ-like approach is to worry less about being right and to focus more on being good, kind, loving, compassionate, and understanding. The Christ-like approach is to be humble and to value someone else's agenda as much as our own. We all have abundant opportunities to show kindness, to put aside our own self-centeredness, to resist the knee-jerk reaction to judge other comments or desires as wrong. We can surrender the impulse to criticize or argue, and instead listen with openness to better understand the perspective of others. We can respond with benevolent words, and we can offer the gift of kindness. Try searching acts of kindness on the internet. You'll be inspired. Sometimes the hardest places to show kindness are in our own families. We get into the habit of seeing faults, disagreements, and irritations. Our prosecuting attorneys take charge of our soul shrivel. Our prosecuting attorneys take charge, and our souls shrivel. Jesus invites us towards the expansive and redemptive view. One of his prophets has expressed the challenge this way. We all have our weakness and failings. Sometimes the husband sees a failing in his wife, and he upbraids her with it. Sometimes the wife feels that her husband has not done just the right thing, and she upbraids him. What good does it do? Is not forgiveness better? Is not charity better? Is not love better? Isn't it better not to speak of faults, not to magnify weaknesses by iterating and reiterating them? Isn't that better? And will not the union that has been cemented between you and the birth of children, and by the bond of the new and everlasting covenant, Be more secure when you forget to mention weaknesses and faults one of another. Is it not better to drop them and say nothing about them, bury them and speak only of the good that you know and feel one for another, and thus bury each other's faults and not magnify them? Isn't that better? Joseph S. Smith. It is ironic that we who are so full of imperfections are so ready to correct imperfections in others. It is also ironic that we who hate to be corrected imagine that our family members will welcome correction. The biggest difference between the natural family member and the man or woman of Christ is the willingness to reliably see goodness. Elder Joseph B. Wirthlin observed, when we are filled with kindness, we are not judgmental. The Savior taught, judge not, and you shall not be judged. Condemn not, and you shall not be condemned. Forgive, and you shall be forgiven. He also taught that with what judgment you judge, you shall be judged. And with what measure you meet, it shall be measured to you again. But you ask, what if the people are rude? Love them. If they are obnoxious, love them. But what if they offend? Surely I must do something then. Love them. Wayward? The answer is the same. Be kind, love them. It is so much better to be good than to be right. So the happy irony is that it is sweet and satisfying to look for the good. It is edifying to celebrate virtue. It is uplifting to be encouraging. As Mormon taught us, but charity is the pure love of Christ, and it endureth forever. And whoso is found possessed of it at the last day, it shall be well with him. Invitations. 1. Next time your partner expresses pain, pause your natural reactions. Turn your full attention to his or her distress. Try to understand his or her feelings. Offer words of compassion. The next time you are tempted to argue with someone, catch yourself. Seek to understand that person's point of view. Take time to understand why it makes sense to him or her. The next 3, next time you think your spouse's ideas are weird or illogical, pause. Take a few breaths and then try to enter his or her world. Don't judge. See if you can understand your spouse's point of view. 4, look for opportunities to agree with, support, and be kind to the people in your life, especially your spouse.